The year was 1918. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns of the Great War finally fell silent. Across Europe, crowds erupted in celebration. But in Germany, there was no victory, only a stunned, somber silence. The nation was a ghost of its former self. The war had claimed the lives of over 2 million of its sons, leaving millions more physically and psychologically scarred. The Allied naval blockade had starved its people, and its political foundations had crumbled with the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. For Germany, the end of the fighting was not the end of the suffering, it was merely the beginning of a new, agonizing chapter. The German army, though undefeated in the field by their own estimation, was forced to retreat. This bitter reality gave birth to a potent and poisonous myth that would haunt the nation for years to come, the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth. The belief that Germany had not been defeated militarily, but betrayed from within by weak-willed politicians, socialists, and Jews. It was a lie, but a comforting one for a nation desperate to understand its own collapse. In the opulent Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the same hall where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871, the victors dictated the terms of peace. The German delegation was not invited to negotiate, they were summoned to sign. The document they were presented with was a devastating blow. The Treaty of Versailles, or the Diktat, as it was known in Germany, was designed to permanently cripple the nation. Territorially, Germany was dismembered. The industrial heartland of Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. The newly created nation of Poland was given a corridor to the sea, cutting East Prussia off from the rest of the country. All of Germany's overseas colonies were seized. Militarily, the nation was neutered. Its army was slashed to a mere 100,000 men, forbidden from possessing an air force, tanks, or submarines. But perhaps the most humiliating blow was Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. It forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war and all its devastation. This clause served as the legal basis for the crushing reparations that would be demanded, a sum so vast, 132 billion gold marks, that it seemed designed to keep Germany in economic servitude for generations. The once proud German Empire was not just defeated, it was systematically dismantled and shamed before the world. This national humiliation echoed in the daily lives of the German people. They wandered through streets lined not only with the physical ruins of war, but with the ruins of their national pride. The men who returned from the front, promised a hero's welcome, found a country that could offer them no work, no future, and no respect. Disillusioned and angry, many were drawn to the ranks of the Freikorps, right-wing paramilitary groups composed of demobilized soldiers who clung to their weapons and their hatred of the new republic. For ordinary citizens, the struggle was for survival. The economy was in tatters, and the social fabric was unraveling. The sense of a shared national purpose that had fueled the war effort was replaced by a gnawing feeling of betrayal and a desperate search for someone to blame. Then came the economic apocalypse. In January 1923, when Germany defaulted on a reparations payment, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. The German government, in an act of defiance, called for passive resistance and began printing vast sums of money to pay the striking workers. The result was hyperinflation on a scale the world had never seen. The German mark, once a stable currency, became utterly worthless. The numbers became surreal, astronomical. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200 billion marks by November. Workers collected their wages in suitcases and wheelbarrows, rushing to the stores before prices could double again in a matter of hours. The nation's entire economic structure collapsed into absurdity. Banknotes were cheaper than wallpaper, so people plastered their walls with them. They were cheaper than firewood, so they were burned for heat. For the German middle class, the backbone of the nation, it was an extinction-level event. Their life savings, pensions, and investments, accumulated over generations, evaporated into thin air. The economic chaos destroyed more than just wealth. It shattered faith in the government, in democracy, and in the very concept of a stable society. At the heart of this maelstrom was Germany's fledgling democracy, the Weimar Republic. Born from the ashes of the empire, it was a government associated from its inception with defeat and humiliation. It was tasked with the impossible, holding the nation together while being attacked from all sides. The political landscape became a battlefield. On the far left, communists, inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, sought to overthrow the state, leading to bloody street battles like the Spartacist uprising of 1919. On the far right, a constellation of nationalist, monarchist, and Volkish groups dreamed of restoring an authoritarian order and avenging the shame of Versailles. They attempted their own coups like the Cap Putsch in 1920. The Republic's own constitution, while progressive in many ways, contained fatal flaws. A system of proportional representation created a fractured parliament of tiny parties, leading to weak, unstable coalition governments that were unable to act decisively. And ominously, Article 48 gave the president emergency powers to rule by decree, a constitutional backdoor that would one day be used to dismantle democracy itself. It was in this cauldron of chaos, resentment, and despair that a new virulent political force began to fester. In the smoky, raucous beer halls of Munich, a failed artist and decorated corporal from the Great War was discovering his one true talent: demagoguery. He offered a simple, powerful, and poisonous narrative to a people desperate for answers. He told them their suffering was not their fault. He raged against the Treaty of Versailles, against the weak Weimar democracy, and against the November criminals who had signed the armistice. He gave them scapegoats for their misery: the Marxists, the international financiers, and above all, the Jews. His speeches were mesmerizing performances of controlled hysteria, building from quiet conspiratorial whispers to roaring, vein-popping crescendos that held his audiences spellbound. He promised to restore Germany's honor, to rebuild its military, to create a new empire, a Third Reich, and to forge a pure, unified nation. In 1923, he made his first bid for power in the infamous Beer Hall Putsch, an attempt to overthrow the Bavarian government that ended in failure and his arrest. But even in defeat, he won. His trial gave him a national stage to broadcast his ideology. He was no longer just a local agitator, he was a martyr for the nationalist cause. Amid the ashes of a defeated empire and a failing republic, a voice of pure hatred was finding its audience. His name was Adolf Hitler. The year is 1933. Germany is a nation on its knees, haunted by the ghosts of the Great War and crippled by the punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The democratic Weimar Republic, born from defeat, had been plagued by a decade of political instability, violent street clashes, and the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression. Millions were unemployed, their life savings having been wiped out by hyperinflation just years earlier. Into this cauldron of national humiliation, desperation, and resentment stepped Adolf Hitler. On January 30th, he was appointed chancellor through a backroom political deal. The German people, desperate for a savior who promised stability, national pride, and work, had not just handed him the keys, they had unlocked the door to a dictatorship. Within a month, a fire gutted the Reichstag, the German parliament building. Hitler and his Nazi party seized the opportunity, fabricating a communist plot to justify the Reichstag fire decree. This emergency measure, signed by an aging President Hindenburg, suspended basic civil liberties and allowed for the mass arrest of political opponents. It was the legal foundation for a police state. This was swiftly followed by the Enabling Act of 1933, which effectively gave Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws without the involvement of the Reichstag for 4 years. Democracy in Germany was officially dead. His vision was now clear and there was no one left to oppose it. Germany would rise again, not as a broken republic, but as a mighty, thousand-year empire, the Third Reich. One of his first and most popular acts was to systematically dismantle the hated restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty had limited Germany's army to a mere 100,000 men, forbidden it from having an air force, tanks, or submarines, and demilitarized the industrial heartland of the Rhineland. At first, the rearmament was clandestine. Glider clubs served as secret training grounds for future Luftwaffe pilots. Factories designed new tanks under the guise of producing agricultural tractors. But soon, the secrecy gave way to open defiance. In March 1935, Hitler publicly announced the re-establishment of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and the reintroduction of military conscription, swelling the army's ranks to over 500,000 men. The world watched, but did little more than issue verbal condemnations. A year later, in a daring gamble, German troops marched back into the demilitarized Rhineland, reclaiming German sovereignty and testing the resolve of Britain and France. They met no resistance. To fuel this rapid expansion, Germany's entire economy was reoriented for war. Under the direction of Hermann Göring, the 4-year plan was launched in 1936 with the explicit goal of achieving autarky, or national self-sufficiency, and making the nation battle-ready. The slogan was, "Guns over butter," and the nation's industrial might was fully unleashed. Factories that once produced pots and pans now churned out rifles, tanks, and warplanes on an unprecedented scale. Industrial giants like Krupp became indispensable cogs in this new war machine. The Autobahn, often touted as a public works project, was designed with wide, reinforced lanes to serve as military transport routes. Every facet of the German state was being mobilized for a single purpose: conflict. The result of this monumental effort was the Wehrmacht, the new German armed forces. It was born, bigger, faster, and deadlier than anything the treaty had allowed. But its true strength lay in a revolutionary doctrine. German military thinkers, haunted by the static trench warfare of World War I, sought to avoid a war of attrition at all costs. Men like General Heinz Guderian championed a new form of mechanized warfare, concentrating armored divisions, the panzers, to smash through enemy lines. This was the heart of, or lightning war. It was a symphony of violence, a combined arms approach where tanks, motorized infantry, and artillery would be supported from the air by the screaming Stuka dive bombers of the Luftwaffe. But Hitler knew that weapons alone would not win wars. He needed a new way to fight. The Great War had left an indelible scar on the military psyche of Europe. Its defining feature was the brutal, soul-crushing stalemate of trench warfare, where millions perished for gains measured in yards. For the generals of the 1920s and 30s, the paramount question was how to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. While the victorious Allies doubled down on defense, believing stronger fortifications were the answer, a defeated and restricted Germany was forced to think differently. Deep within the German High Command, a cadre of forward-thinking officers, shackled by the Treaty of Versailles which forbade tanks and an air force, began to theorize in the abstract. They envisioned a new kind of war, one of movement and decision. At the forefront of this revolution was a brilliant if often abrasive officer named Heinz Guderian. Guderian had witnessed the potential of the tank in World War I, but he saw it not as a mere infantry support weapon, as the British and French did, but as the decisive arm of a new kind of army. He argued passionately for concentrating tanks into independent formations, or panzer divisions, that could act as a mailed fist, or center of gravity, to punch directly through the enemy's weakest point. This was a radical departure from conventional wisdom. The prevailing doctrine was to sprinkle tanks along the front to assist the infantry's slow advance. Guderian's vision was the opposite. The infantry and artillery would support the panzer's rapid, deep penetration. The goal wasn't to push the enemy back, but to shatter their command structure, sever their supply lines, and create widespread panic and paralysis, causing a total collapse from within. But tanks alone were not enough. Two other technologies were essential to making this theory a reality. The first was the radio. Every German tank was equipped with one, allowing commanders to coordinate movements with a flexibility their opponents could only dream of. The second was air power. The Luftwaffe would not just fight for control of the sky, it would act as flying artillery. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, fitted with its infamous Jericho trumpet siren, was designed to deliver precision strikes on command posts, artillery batteries, and strongpoints, terrorizing defenders and clearing the path for the panzers below. This seamless, real-time coordination of armor, air power, and motorized infantry was the true heart of the concept. They called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. On September 1, 1939, the theory was put to its first brutal test. The world watched as Germany invaded Poland. The Polish army was large and brave, but its strategic planning was fatally flawed. Confident in their defenses and the promise of Allied support, they had deployed their forces thinly along their vast border, making them exquisitely vulnerable to Guderian's concentrated spearheads. They were prepared for a traditional war of fronts, not the surgical strike that was about to hit them. Before the Polish High Command even understood what was happening, German panzers had breached their lines in multiple sectors. Instead of getting bogged down fighting fortified positions, they simply bypassed them, racing into the open country behind. Stuka dive bombers screamed from the skies, destroying communication lines and sowing terror. The Polish forces, expecting a frontal assault, suddenly found German tanks in their rear, cutting them off from command and supply. The entire Polish defense plan was rendered obsolete in a matter of hours. The speed and ferocity were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Within weeks, it was over. The swift German armored columns linked up deep inside Poland, encircling and destroying entire Polish armies. On September 17th, The Soviet Union invaded from the east, sealing Poland's fate. The nation was crushed between two totalitarian giants. In London and Paris, the reaction was one of shock, followed by a dangerous miscalculation. France and Britain declared war, fulfilling their pledge to Poland, but they failed to grasp the revolutionary nature of the German victory. Military observers dismissed it as a triumph over a second-rate power, not a new way of war. They were still stuck in the old ways of thinking. They put their faith in static defense, in the mighty Maginot Line, and prepared for a long, grinding fight of attrition, a repeat of World War I. This period became known as the Phony War, as the Allies dug in, content to wait for Germany to make the first move. They would soon learn, to their catastrophic cost, that Germany no longer fought by the old rules. By 1940, Hitler turned his gaze westward. France, with its mighty Maginot Line, believed itself safe. But the Germans had a plan, a gamble so bold it would either win the war in a single stroke or end in disaster. Instead of attacking head-on, German forces swept through the Ardennes forest, a region the French had dismissed as impassable for tanks. Emerging on the other side, they raced to the coast, trapping the British and French armies at Dunkirk. France, the great power that had defeated Germany in 1918, fell in just 6 weeks. The world watched in stunned silence. How had this happened? By 1941, Hitler stood at the peak of his power. From the frozen fjords of Norway to the deserts of North Africa, German soldiers marched victorious. The Soviet Union, his supposed ally, was next. Operation Barbarossa began with another stunning Blitzkrieg. Millions of German troops poured into Russia, capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. By winter, some forward units could see the spires of Moscow in the distance. It seemed nothing could stop the German war machine. But then, the mistakes began. Hitler, overconfident, declared war on the United States after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. The vast resources of America now joined the fight. In Russia, the German advance stalled. The Soviets, though battered, refused to break. Winter came, and with it, disaster. German soldiers, unprepared for the cold, froze in their boots. The tide was turning. Meanwhile, the Allies adapted. They learned from Blitzkrieg, developing their own fast-moving tactics. The skies filled with British and American bombers, pounding German cities. By 1944, the once unstoppable Wehrmacht was in retreat. The D-Day landings opened a second front. The Soviets pushed westward, vengeance in their hearts. In April 1945, Soviet troops fought their way into Berlin. Hitler, trapped in his bunker, took his own life. On May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. The German army, once the most feared in the world, lay in ruins. Germany's early success was no accident. It was the result of brilliant strategy. Blitzkrieg rewrote the rules of war. Superior technology, tanks, planes, and radios gave them the edge. Momentum and morale victories fed more victories. But in the end, overconfidence, overextension, and the sheer industrial might of the Allies sealed their fate. The German army was effective, until it wasn't. And that made all the difference. Today, the ruins of Hitler's Reich serve as a warning. No empire, no matter how powerful, is invincible. Speed and innovation can win battles, but arrogance and overreach lose wars. And so, the story of the German war machine remains one of the most dramatic and cautionary tales in military history. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more history content.